Rainbow Warrior here, and today I'm going to show you how to knit this really simple dancer shrug. This is a really basic pattern and it's really easy to adjust to create whatever you're needing. So before we begin, we're going to need to measure. This is really important because everyone has different body sizes, as well as everyone may be creating something different. So in order to determine the width of our garment, you are going to measure from arm to arm, depending on what type of shrug you're creating. So I simply measured from the bottom of my shoulder to the opposite shoulder, while if you're making something really chunky, you'd want to measure from elbow to elbow. Basically, wherever you want your sleeves to fall is where you're going to measure. And be sure to get someone to help you with this step so you can get an accurate measurement. Next, to determine the length, this is what is going to be wrapping around our arms. So the longer our garment, the bigger and chunkier our shrug is going to be. So I knit a rectangular shape because, as you can see, I created something just to cover my shoulders and it covers my upper back. It's really just quite long enough to connect underneath the arms. So the length is, again, what's going around your arm. The longer you make it, the bigger these sleeves are going to be. So if you're making a big chunky shrug, be sure to make more of a square shaped garment. Now that we have our measurements, we really need to determine our gauge. And if you've never heard that word before, it's really simple. You're basically going to knit out a sample of your work with the needles that you're going to use and the yarn you're working with, and then you're going to measure an X amount, meaning pick an amount of inches, or if you're like everyone else, an amount of centimeters, and determine how many stitches make up that amount. So for example, I always work with 4 inches. And then how many rows make up that measurement as well. And then you're going to need to do a little bit of math, and you can determine, based on how wide you're making your garment and how many stitches make up a small sample amount, you can determine how many stitches you need in total. And this step is just really important. Really take the time to do it because it's really frustrating knitting out something like this and then getting the wrong measurements at the end. And even if you are using the same needles and the same yarn, take the time to do it because everyone has different hands, everyone has a different gauge. Alright, for my materials, I am working with size US 10 needles, and I am working on circular needles, but don't let that confuse you. I'm knitting them as if straight back and forth. For my yarn, I'm using Red Heart Soft in the color Chocolate. We're going to begin casting on, and I'm using a long tail cast on method just because it is my favorite and my preferred method. So I'm measuring out a pretty long tail, and I'm going to begin casting on 94 stitches. I am working with a multiple number of 4 stitches because I'm doing a 2x2 rib, and then plus 2 for my edge stitches. I am going to be doing a chain edge for this garment. I'll show you how to do that, but I also wanted to mention that if you're more experienced, you can edge this garment however method you prefer. Now that I have all of my stitches cast onto my needles, I am going to begin my pattern. Again, I am doing a chain edge, and this is how you do that. For every first stitch of every row, we're going to slip the first stitch purlwise, so entering it purlwise and then slipping it onto our needle. Now we need to move that yarn because we're going to begin knitting, and as I mentioned, I'm doing a 2x2 rib. It's the look I'm going for, so I'm going to be knitting 2, and then purling 2. And we are going to work this pattern of knitting 2, purling 2, all the way down our row until we reach our last stitch. Alright, finishing up my pattern, and on our last stitch, after we purl 2, we're going to edge this one by knitting it through the back loop. So we're going to knit the last stitch through the back loop on every row. Alright, now we're starting our second row, and we're still ribbing, so we're just going to do the same thing. slipping the first stitch purlwise, making sure that yarn is in front of our needle, and then knitting 2, purling 2. And I'm going to do this for a few rows until I'm satisfied with the length. I'm going to do 12 rows of my 2x2 rib. I'm on my last row, and don't forget we're knitting that last stitch through the back loop. And now it's time to start our stockinette stitch. And as you can see, hopefully, on the edge we have a nice chain look that I'm really happy with. So we're still slipping the first stitch purlwise, and for our odd rows, when we're on our right side, we're going to be knitting every stitch. There are those chains on our edge. And I did this because it's a lot easier to seam up. And it's a nice looking edge. It kind of looks like crochet to me. So we're knitting every stitch. And don't forget we're still knitting the last stitch through the back loop if you're doing that chain edge with me. Alright, now we're on an even row, so we're on the opposite side or the wrong side. We're still slipping that first stitch purlwise, and I want to make a bigger edge for this stockinette section because it tends to roll up a lot. So I'm knitting the next 2 stitches, and now I'm going to begin purling every stitch. And I think if I went back and made this shrug, I would have knit a few more edge stitches. But definitely comment down below and let me know your favorite way to edge your garments. I would love to know. And we're just going to keep doing this pattern. So knitting on all the odd sides, our right side, and purling on all of our wrong sides. And since we did those 2 knit edge stitches on our one side, we have to do it at the end as well. So save those last 3 stitches because we're going to knit 2. And then knit the last one through the back loop. So just make sure you're doing the same amount of edging stitches on both sides. And continue these 2 rows until you have the length needed in order to start your next section of ribbing. We want to have an equal amount of ribbing on both sides. So we're just going to knit the length we need for our garment. Alright, here you can see I knit out the length that I needed. It's the perfect amount really. I have just enough to use 1 skein of yarn. As you can see, this measures 12 to 13 inches, I think it said. And again, this is just long enough to wrap around my arms nicely and just cover my upper back. And there you can see my edge. And we're going to begin our second rib section. So we're doing the same thing as before, however many rows you decided to do, our 2x2 rib, and still doing our chain edge. So slipping the first stitch purlwise, and then knitting 2, purling 2. And I'm doing another 12 rows. And now that my knitting is complete, it's time to bind off. And I'm going to bind off in pattern, meaning I'm simply going to purl the first stitch, still slip it purlwise. Now since the next stitch is a knit, I'm going to knit the next stitch. And now I'm going to pass that first stitch over my second stitch. Now continue knitting the next stitch, passing the first stitch over the second. Now I come to a purl stitch, so I'm going to purl that stitch. Then pass the first stitch over the second, purling the next one. And I'm going to continue this all the way down, knitting the knit stitches and purling the purl stitches and pulling the first stitch over the second stitch. So we're going to do this all the way down until all of our stitches are off our needles. Alright, the last step is to seam our garment. To complete it, as you can see, we have our rectangular shape. We're going to put both of the long sides together, so our widths are being stacked on top of each other. As you can see, our two rib sections. And I apologize that my yarn is so dark. And now you're going to line up your stitches. You can pin your garment, you can clamp it down if you need to, and we're going to seam up as far as you need and leave the top open, obviously, because that's going to be your armhole. And I am going to seam both of my sides off camera. I really apologize if you needed to see how to do it if you're a beginner, but I'm a beginner as well, and I really wanted to take the time to make sure I was picking up the right stitches and everything like that. So if you need a tutorial, I'm sure there are tons of great ones out there on YouTube, and there are a few different techniques to seaming as well. So thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this pattern. Be sure to leave me any questions you have in the comments down below, and subscribe for more tutorials. I really hope to be making more of these shrugs. My mind is kind of blown that a simple square or rectangular shape can make such a gorgeous garment. So I have lots of other patterns bouncing around in my mind right now that I'm excited to show you. So again, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video.